Hey everybody, welcome back to the Vassals of Kingsgrave Agatha Christie Reread. My name is Bina007 and I will be your host today for our reread or read for the first time of The ABC Murders, originally published in 1936. Today I'm super thrilled because I am joined by Hannah.
Hey, it's Hannah Shadow on the whatever the hell it's called. I guess it's just Wing Shadow now. I should change
Wing
it.
Shadow on the Discord. And if you'd like to get involved with Vassals of Kingsgrave, it's a gorgeous, lovely, welcoming community. Hit us up on Twitter or on vokpodcast.wordpress.com and you can find a link to our Discord server. And also by first-time reader, Zander.
Wait, I'm on mute. I'm not on mute. Hello, it's me.
Bonjour. And we are rejoining today after a little hiatus, a little pause in our reread for the ABC Murders. As I said before, this is another Hercule Poirot, Inspector Japp, and indeed Captain Hastings book. So it's reuniting the three musketeers, which I'm assuming makes Xander very happy. As always, we're going to have a non-spoilery discussion about the context of the book, some of the key characters, the structure of the book. Then we'll have a discussion about what we liked and didn't like about it. We'll talk a little bit about stuff that hasn't aged as well, that has aged well. We'll maybe get into the adaptations, but then in an end of podcast episode section, we will get into who done it and maybe how the different adaptations treat that too. So you can be spoiler free up until a certain point. That will be very clearly signposted. But before we get into it, let's get into our lemon cake ratings, called lemon cakes because that is from our origin as a Game of Thrones podcast. But Xander, first time reader, how did you find the ABC Murders?
My favorite so far.
Yes.
I absolutely loved it. The structure is super interesting, kind of fun, kind of weird. Because how she switches the perspectives, and it's almost a little. You get like a little whiplash if you don't realize it at first. But it's great. I love Hastings. It's great to have my man's back. Same with Japp and of course Hercule.
Absolutely, Hannah. I know you love this book, so.
Indeed, I give it 5 out of 5 lemon cakes or 100 out of 10 little gray cells.
Yeah, I mean, I also love this book. It's not maybe in my top 5, but it would be close out of like whatever the 66 novels that she wrote. I think it's phenomenal. I think it really holds up well. It's an absolutely brilliantly plotted book filled with amazing characters. We've got our three musketeers as well. To me, this is just it's just fantastic. It's Agatha Christie in the late 30s in her absolute prime. Let's talk about the form of the novel. So if you haven't read it, listener, it is unusual because it's a combination of first-person narrative and third-person narrative. So the third-person narrative is Agatha Christie narrating the novel and telling us what Poirot, Japp, and Hastings are up to and how the murders are going to unfold. But then there's also a first-person narrative from the perspective of one of the characters in the novel that we are led to believe is indeed the murderer. It's not the first time that she's done this. She previously used this format in The Man in the Brown Suit, which was one of her early adventure stories that we covered near the start of this podcast series. So she did it then. And when she did it then, it was really interesting because she did the first person narrative from the perspective of the person that we then, actually, I'm not going to say who that person is because I'll edit that out because I don't want to spoil it. So she has used the device before, but here I think it is just masterly. Although it's really interesting that because she's had Hastings as the narrator in earlier books, what she tells us is that supposedly the ABC Murders is being sort of recreated and reconstructed by Hastings, who's still kind of the narrator, but this time he's sort of putting it together what people have said. So how, Hannah, maybe for me, like how much of the form is why you love this?
It's a lot of why I love it. For me, it's just such a big departure from her normal stuff. Even in the modern day, I think it really has stood the test of time as being something unique. There's 2 other novels that she has later that are along this structural line that we'll get to, and they are all 3 together in my top 3.
So you
and
obviously
and
really
that's why
respond
I
to it.
like them. I think
Yeah.
they're darker, and there's something about them that it's just a lot more like watching David Fincher's like Zodiac for the first time, and
Yeah.
like learning about the Yorkshire Ripper for the first time. And this is one of the only ones that I really, when I first read it, I thought might not get solved. Like I thought it might be one of a series because it was just
Yeah.
so vast and intriguing. So
And
the
yeah.
structure for me really hits well.
And getting into the mind of someone who, we are led to believe that you're in the mind of a killer as well. Just shows how good she is at writing it. Zander, do you like serial killer stories in general? I mean, this is different, right? Because this is a detective story. So it's an Agatha Christie book because it's Poirot, but it's also, she's describing a serial killer, which is unusual both for Agatha Christie and actually for detective fiction of its time. This is one of the first serial killer books. So is that a genre you like apart from detective fiction?
It's kind of funny that you're asking me that because I was just looking at my Devil in the White City book. Not not particularly. It's never been something I've been super interested other than when I was, quite younger. Like Jack the Ripper was super interesting, which of course she mentions a few times in this book. But beyond that, no, not really. But I mean, I still enjoy the book, because it is a good detective story. I will say it kind of reminded me. I don't know if you guys watched the show Dexter back on Showtime.
No.
But the feeling of this almost reminds me of this season with John Lithgow, which I
Oh
you
yeah,
know what I
I
mean?
know what
Like
you
it kind
mean.
of gives me that
Yes, I
feeling, and
do.
I really enjoyed that.
I'm now inspired to go seek that out.
Well,
If
I
you're
think
gonna,
the
that's the
season with
only
John
season
Lithgow,
worth watching
man,
it. Yeah, it's the only
honest to
season worth
God,
watching.
you have to watch all of them to get there, but holy shit, that one is like you could stop after it and it's fine.
John
okay.
Lithgow's
Well,
best performance.
that is wow. Okay. Well, that is strong. I will definitely check it out. And if any of you out there listening have seen the Dexter Lithgow season and think that there are links to this, and please feel free to send us a note or comment on the YouTube because that's fascinating. Maybe it was inspired by this. So
I'm
as I said,
surprised you haven't seen that, Bina. I think you'd really like it.
I think when Dexter originally came out, it was on like a satellite. It was only on a premium satellite channel, and I only had like basic TV at that point. So it wasn't as big here, I think, as it maybe was in the States. Anyway, so let's cut to the chase. The premise of this book, which is not a spoiler, is that there is a serial killer murdering people with alliterative names and places of the murder. So the murders follow an alphabetical order, starting with a victim whose initials are A in a town called A. So the first victim is Alice Asher. She's killed in her tobacco shop in Andover. And then we'll have the murder of Elizabeth Betty Barnard, who's a flirty waitress killed on the beach at Bexhill, which at the time would have been, a mass tourist British seaside destination. And then we have the murder of Sir Carmichael Clark, who's a very wealthy man killed at his home in a village called Churston. So in each murder, the name and the town alliterate. And there's also an ABC rail guide left beside the victim. So you have to imagine that in the age where rail travel was really the most common form of travel, right? Even mass car ownership was not there at this stage. So knowing the railway timetable was really the thing you had to have. So rather than a road atlas in every house, you would have had the railway timetable. And there's a number of different guides at the time. One of the really iconic ones is the Bradshaw's Guide, which did all the European trains. So you see that referred to in Murder on the Orient Express. But the ABC rail guide would have been in every single home. It would have had all the kind of the train times in England, a bit like the A to Z of London, which is like a book of maps of London, which was in every home up until we all got mobile devices. So that is left beside every victim. And what's interesting is that for Poirot, the murders appear to lack a motive, right? Because it just feels like they're almost being picked from the telephone directory by name for the town at random. And the whole plot of the book is Poirot trying to figure out, is there a connection between these murders? And if so, what is the motive of the murder? And the person who's committing the murders, ABC, self-titled, a bit like the Jack the Ripper letters that weren't actually from Jack the Ripper, probably, that were written to the police. the murderer is apparently writing to Poirot and taunting him and saying, look, you can't catch me. You think you're so clever. Will you get the next one? I'm going to do the next one. So with each murder, the pressure rises and the public's aware of it, right? So everyone with the letter D living in a D town is going to get very nervous after the C murder. So this, unlike the previous murders, which were very sort of intimate and just in a family or in a village and very private crimes to be solved in a way, this really sees Poirot now famous and I guess doing his detecting in a very high profile case, which I think is quite interesting as well. How did you guys find the concept of Poirot as a public figure? Like, we get the feeling over the past books he's becoming more wealthy, more famous. He's traveling internationally, you know, like famous people consulting him. But this is Poirot kind of as an iconic public figure that the murderer is taunting. How does that change, Zander, your view of Poirot? Because, I mean, you love Poirot, right?
Of course. He's almost the man made for this, in a way. You know, even if he's, you know, of course, overly polite and, you know, oh, no, you know, it's okay. I'm not that big of a deal. But secretly inside his, you know, tiny little gray cells, he's loving it.
And also, he of course thinks he is a big deal.
Right.
Yeah. I love how this kind of chart. I love how the fame of Poirot probably charts the fame of Agatha Christie, and the idea that she will, by the time of writing this book, has experience of being, you know, on the front page of newspapers and being a very famous person. So she can probably write about how that feels with some authority. But it is interesting that this is a very, very public murder. It's also, I noticed, the first book where really the Great Depression is properly mentioned. You know, the Great Depression began in 1932, and this is a book published in 1936, but you're starting to see its impact. And it's interesting that it's the motivation of why Hastings comes home, because he's got to sort out his financial situation. So that was a little bit of context there. Otherwise, not too many Christie-verse mentions. At one point, Inspector Japp says that Poirot will end up detecting his own death, which makes one wonder if she was writing Poirot's last case, which is called Curtain at this point, because that's kind of part of the plot of that. And she wrote it kind of in advance, thinking, God, if anything happens to me, at least they can publish it after my death. And Poirot also lays out the premise to the novel Cards at the Table, which again is the idea of a very intimate novel. So he says, what would be the perfect crime to detect is if you just had four people sitting at a card table playing bridge, and one of them sitting out, and at the end of the night they realized the person sitting out on the sofa was killed, and then only between the four of them you would have to detect who did it. So he kind of lays out the premise of a future book too. But other than that, it's not one of those books where there are endless kind of Christie-verse clues, which, I don't know, again, makes it feel, I guess, a little bit like a standalone murder, other than the characters carrying over.
It does stand out. I will say, just to clarify something you said a little while ago about the ABC rail guides.
Yeah.
For our younger listeners out there, before you had Google Maps, you used to have maps of the road in your car. Yeah. These big thick books that you would carry around everywhere, believe it or not. And that's how you knew where you were going. And they were made of this thing called paper.
And you needed to know how to use grid references. Sounds so patronizing. But, you know, even very recently when my friend Kiri and I did a road trip in Northern Ireland to go and look at Game of Thrones locations, and that was only probably 2015, 16. I actually did a little podcast on it for Vox, so if those of you who are interested can go listen to that. And we took a proper roadmap of Northern Ireland, all charted out, because we were going in very wild parts of the Northern Irish coast, and we would have had no idea where we were going, and we couldn't be sure of mobile phone signal. And I would always say to you youngsters out there, Auntie Bina says, maybe just carry a road atlas, because you never know when you're going to lose your phone or run out of signal or run out of cellular coverage or minutes left on your phone. So Auntie Bina says, stay safe, take some paper. And that's a VOK POSA for all the kids out there. Let's get into characters. Poirot, we discover in this book that he dyes his hair and that he thinks Hastings should wear a toupee, but he insists his moustaches are real. How do we feel about the fact that Poirot dyes his hair? I think it's a bit, I don't know, I found it a bit mocking, like Agatha Christie's, like, you know, denigrating Poirot. I didn't like this, but how do we feel?
I thought it was kind of funny.
Yeah. I mean, sorry, you go, Hannah.
I like how it starts off with that conversation, and it puts Poirot in this vulnerable place already. which
that's a
I
good
feel
take.
like it carries it through the rest of the book, but there's this juxtaposition. So we've seen in other cases where they are more self-contained, these bottle episodes of murder that he's been involved in, how hard he is on himself and how deprecating he can be. I'm an imbecile when he misses something and a second murder is occurring. And in this one, there's this weird contrast where he's not as hard on himself because it truly kind of is out of his hands and there's a randomness to it.
Yeah.
But we see him wounded in this other way as the setup to the overall story.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. I mean, he's still a bit of an asshole to Hastings, right? I mean, at one point he says Hastings is there so that Poirot doesn't, quote, overlook the obvious. But when we get to the spoiler section, I'm going to point out one obvious point that Hastings gets that Poirot didn't, which was very crucial. So,
yeah, I do feel like this one, Agatha Christie lightens up on Hastings a lot.
Yeah, or maybe,
and it makes me wonder, like, if there was an interpersonal thing, or maybe a demand from her publisher to kind of, well, he's a jolly fellow, and everyone, your fans like him, so lighten up.
He does become the charming avuncular Hastings of the novels. He's a bit feckless, but basically lovely.
Yeah, and this is one of the first ones I read, so it might be why Hastings is so endearing to me.
Yeah, I mean, I like Hastings, but yeah, Poirot does take the piss out of him a little bit, though, as we would imagine. Not much more info on Hastings or Japp, though, I don't think. Do you feel that you had a different impression of them, or any evolution in your understanding of them as characters, or any of them, really, the Three Musketeers?
I think it just proves that, obviously she's been writing these for a while at this point, but just almost a natural character development and aging. She kind of effortlessly writes with those characters, without being, it had been 5 years since this one incident and he learned from it better. She writes it very more natural, as if, it is just three old coworkers getting back together again, kind of thing.
Yeah, it feels very organic and light, doesn't it? Like, I feel that they are very comfortable with each other and their roles. And I think we feel comfortable with them, and she probably could just write them very naturally and comfortably too. I feel that ease and lightness of touch is it's kind of like a center of warmth in a novel that's actually very dark. And I'm really pleased all three of them are in it, because I think you need that wholesome, lovely friendship. And there is a kind of mutual respect, isn't there, between all three of them at the end of the day. And I think that contrasts against what's an incredibly dark story, actually, for the rest of it. And It keeps you grounded in something lovely.
Because it's quite a thriller,
Yeah.
Because, I mean, on its first read, especially, it's very tense. And I do think that balances it out a bit to see some of those other elements at play.
I agree. Well, let's get into some of the other characters as well. So, as I said, we've got the three murder victims, but then you have ancillary characters around that. So, as in a normal Agatha Christie, you'd have a murder victim and you get to know that family. Here, it's kind of three distinct groupings. So, Alice Asher in Andover married, after the First World War, a German husband. So, naturally, one should maybe suspect a nasty foreigner. He is drunk. He doesn't treat her very well, but she has a very dutiful niece who she was very fond of and who seems very sad about her death. And the drunk German husband is sort of immediately arrested after her murder. So that's the setup there. Betty Barnard and Bexhill. And again, I think with all of these murders, you see sort of something a bit nasty and a bit sort of dark in English society. So with Alice Asher, working class women, the drunk husband, so a picture of sort of a not happy spousal relationship. Then Betty Barnard is kind of the opposite. She's young, she's flirty. I think we're led to believe that she's quite that she is probably quite promiscuous, like she's very sex positive in the terminology of our time. She's got a straight talking sister called Megan, who's maybe much more straight laced and maybe a bit envious of Betty. And we definitely have a jealous boyfriend called Donald Fraser, who thinks that Betty and he are engaged, but She has obviously been flirting with some of the customers at the tea shop that she works in. Bexhill being a town that lots of people would be coming by train to have day trips at the seaside, so lots of opportunities for casual encounters. But I think it is interesting in a novel from 1936 that you see a young girl with a job who's got an income and can spend it on tights and can spend it on makeup and looking good, and who wants to be taken out to have a good time. And I think that's kind of quite refreshing, right? Unfortunately, she comes to a bad end. And then again, another slice of society. So you've got the older working class women in a bad marriage, then you've got the younger, flirty, maybe more next generation women in Bexhill. And then finally, you've got some Carmichael Clark, who is, a rich pillar of society in a big country house in Churston, but he has a very sick wife who, he loves very much, but she's very sick. He's got a pretty young secretary, alert siren goes. And he's also got a younger brother who's maybe a little bit feckless and has come home from overseas service to sort of be with the brother because the wife's not very well. So that's the family set up there. And those are the kind of the partners of the victims who are going to get together and actually work with Poirot, or who tried to work with Poirot and the police to try and figure out what were the circumstances of these murders, and was there anything that linked them, or were they just completely random? Were there any of the kind of side characters or victims that you found particularly compelling, or how did you feel about these three different stories? Any of them particularly grab your attention?
Well, I definitely feel like this novel is also very unique because it has so many victims. So there are the murder victims, and then the victims, like by proxy of them within their family, that we don't normally have. We usually have a victim and suspects, and any one of them could have done it, right? And so it's just such a different animal when you're reading it, where like none of them are the suspects really, and it can be difficult to wrap your mind around the volume of that. And I think that might be why she takes some of the tones of Poirot down a little bit, is he's being more sensitive around people that he is viewing as victims and not suspects, at least for the first couple acts of this book.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody like particularly stood out to me, but I don't know how to phrase it right, because it is a darker story than most of her other murder mysteries. I really appreciated the almost like ground level she brings us of like the mourning friends and family of these victims, and like you're saying, the sympathies that we get to see Poirot actually have, when more often than more, like in the other stories he's usually more boisterous and playful, but this one's he's a little more somber and thoughtful. So
yeah, and I genuinely worried too, like that the murderer is not among them, so he needs to be extra sharp and keep his attention on a couple different places, right? Like especially the first time through is how that really reads for me. I do like Mary Drower, and I like that Megan Barnard, after she's pressed a little bit, comes out and says Betty was an unmitigated ass. Because no one wants to speak ill of the dead, and it's her sister. But it's just so true too, like that. Yeah. Just because people are dead, it doesn't mean that they were perfect when they were alive, and it's harsh and it sounds jarring, but it's, to the investigation, an extremely helpful piece.
Yeah, and I think what makes it such a successful book is, it's a detective story, it's a serial killer book, it's a thriller, but it's also just a very good, rather dark portrait about how families work, and the sort of petty rivalries, but also the love that can exist in a family at the same time. And I think Agatha Christie writes very well and observes very well, sort of, again, like you say, you can try and fantasize and idolize the dead, but just ultimately, for a story that in some ways I said isn't like her typical crimes because they're private, they're in the family, they're in a certain setting. And this is played out on the canvas of the entire country and herring about on trains to different cities and trying to figure out what's going on. But actually, when you get down into the motivations and into what makes it quite gripping, it is just the human character studies of, how different family members get on.
And to that point, in later act of the book, there's a chapter that's not from Captain Hastings' personal narrative and not from this other character. It's from a totally new character that comes out of nowhere. And it's very short, but you know so much about this person in just a few pages of their internal monologue in this movie theater. And it really reminds me of spoilers for this, but in Stephen King's The Stand, there's a chapter like that comes out of nowhere from a totally new character, POV, and it's fucking brilliant. Like, at first you're like, what is this? Why is this? But it's genius. And it's so, there's so many layers and dimensions to this person. Like, it's not just a character, it's a true person, and there's all these personality traits that come through in such a brief little bit of internal monologue. And I think that's where she psychologically is really in touch with people and the little quirks and ticks that make them them.
Yeah, I think that's very valid.
Well said.
Okay.
I don't know if you've ever read The Stand and you know the chapter I'm talking about, but if you haven't, go read it.
I
It's
do.
amazing.
I do.
It's really brilliant.
Okay, so we'll save some of this for the spoilery bit. Okay, so let's talk about the book in its context. Like I said, it was written in 1930, or written probably in 1935, but published 1936. A very difficult time for Britain, for Europe, the rise of fascism, Spanish Civil War, increasingly politicized anti-Semitism, just a very, very difficult period. And it makes you very aware, I think, of whether the book is regressive or progressive in its views. And we'll get into this a bit with the adaptation, if any of you have seen it, the most recent one. But what I think is quite interesting is at one point in this book, there's an angry interviewee who resents retelling his story to two foreigners. And Poirot isn't even insulted, but is just amused that Hastings is also seen as a foreigner, which I found really interesting, that Poirot's almost like desensitized to people being treating him less than because he's a foreigner. And also there's a couple of times, or at least one time, where when Poirot asks if Betty Bernard was pretty, where they kind of look askance at him and sort of assume that he's just interested in her looks because he's a Frenchman, and Frenchmen are just lascivious, right? And he's not even French, he's Belgian. So it's kind of like, nationalism or racism upon racism. And then, he even, at some point, I think Japp or someone asks Poirot if the murderer is motivated against him because he's a foreigner. So it just feels like this is a book that's kind of quite aware of bigotry, or is talking more about it as something that's happening to Poirot, but not in the funny way of people mispronouncing his name or calling him French. Like it's a bit more seriously engaged with just sort of low-level, everyday nationalism or racism, which I thought was kind of interesting. But maybe I was being oversensitive because, I don't know, just seeing that 2018 adaptation, which is so interested in race, maybe it's not really in the book as much as I thought. I wonder what you guys think, having reread it for the first time.
I will say it's definitely more noticeable than in her other novels. And I think it might just because me being like hyper aware of when it was written and published while I was reading it. But it almost seems like she wrote it with some intention to like kind of show how vapid and stupid it is, because it, like we're saying, it was 1935. She probably wrote it when published in 36. So with all, like you're saying, with all the nationalism and racism going on in Europe and the wider world at that time, we're between the two major wars.
Yeah. It is.
I think it's a little, I took it as a little more subtle than some of the other ones. Like you have Murder on the Orient Express, the whole Cassini thing. And, there's a couple places rereading Murder on the Orient Express where I'm surprised they didn't use that post World War I slur for Italians, like in several places. Like just this one's like a little more, I don't know, woven in and like deep, like a stain that won't come out of a fabric. Like there's a few times where they're like, oh, it must be a Chinese person, just like foreigners to do this and stuff. But it's more of like a throwaway thing. And I think what's even darker and more sinister than that is they keep talking about people that served in the war, right? And how people that served in the war are all fucked up. and 3 years from when people were first reading this, Germany's going to invade Poland. And like, I don't know if they could see it on the horizon quite as much as like now, obviously we know, but man, what dark times like in Europe back then.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do believe it was a somewhat conscious effort on her part, because like you're saying, Hannah, in her previous novel, she is a bit more playful and absurd with it, kind of almost on like a Mel Brooks level of satirical way of writing. But in this one, she kind of dials it down to a really more realistic and uncomfortable way of having it in her novel still as a dialogue.
Yeah, which I guess is true. I mean, that represents real people. It's just gross, and it's so like embedded, like a tick dug in, and it's sad, especially with modern eyes looking back on it and realizing what that whole region is about to go through in just a few short years. Really sad.
Yeah, I think basically this is a phenomenal book. We all think it's really good. I would say that, if you haven't read it, then do. If you think of Christie as writing safe little, detective stories set in rural English villages with, a vicar and, just very safe and very twee, then try this book. If you think Agatha Christie isn't for you, try it, because this is darker. It's more sophisticated. It's a really fascinating twist, which we will get into shortly. But it's a great one. It's maybe not typical, but I think it really shows you how high quality she can be.
Yeah, just the maturity in her writing in this one that alone is worth the read.
Yeah.
And what I love is to me, it's not the only one. There are at least 2 others that are heavy like this. And so there's a lot to look forward to as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, listener, we hope you've enjoyed that discussion. Obviously, it has to be a bit vague when we're not really getting into the spoilers. But now we're going to bid you adieu. The next book is also going to be an Hercule Poirot book. It's called Murder in Mesopotamia. We're not going to do it as a big group discussion. I'll do it as a mini pod because, frankly, it's kind of weird. This book is so good. And her next book, I don't think is very good. So I'm just going to do that quite brief. And then we're going to be back with you, maybe as all 3 of us, for an Hercule Poirot mystery called Cards at the Table, which is fascinating, Zander. It's basically 4 criminals, 4 detectives of various kinds, 1 victim, all in a locked room mystery. So the 4 detectives have to figure out which of the 4 criminals did it. It's almost like the distillation of detective. After this serial killer thriller out in the whole of England, this is the opposite. It's everything in a tiny little room. So I'm hoping you'll all join me for that one. So listeners, I hope we've whetted your appetite for Cards on the Table. But stay tuned after the end credits music for a spoiler discussion about this book, The ABC Murders. Okay, welcome back, everybody. This is now very much going to be a spoiler-filled version. This is very much going to be a spoiler-filled discussion about this book. And the big revelation in this book, as many of her books have big plot twists, is that we have been reading the first-person narrative of a man called Alexander Bonaparte Cust, initials ABC, and that he very much has been in every place where a murder has been committed. And he very much thinks he has committed the murder. He cannot remember them because he's been blacking out. But he comes to, he is a stocking salesman, so his work takes him on the road. All the people who were murdered had purchased, or the houses that they were in had purchased stockings from him. He has ABC books, and he also has the typewriter on which the Dear Jack, so to say, letters were written. So he thinks he is the murderer, but he is not. He has been exploited by the younger brother of Sir Carmichael Clark, who
Dun, dun, dun.
He met him by chance and learnt of his name and learnt of his condition of presumably epilepsy of some form and blackouts, and decided to exploit him. Gave him this, in an anonymous guise, gave him the job as a stocking salesman, gave him a list of people to visit as potential customers, so incriminating him in place. and basically had killed the A murder and the B murder and threatened a D murder to completely psychopathically, with nothing against these people whatsoever, but to disguise the C murder amongst a whole bunch of other murders. He wants his elder brother dead. He's worried that when his very sickly elderly wife dies, he might marry the young secretary and then have an heir, so he would be disinherited. So it's all the younger brother's fault. Zander, turning to you first, how did you find this solution?
First of all, my man's Alexander Bonaparte did nothing wrong. I
Yeah,
knew it.
man. Did you know it? Did you know when you were reading his narrative?
So, because you know me, I'm not very good at whodunits. I'm not very clever.
Well, you are very clever, but like detecting Agatha Christie is a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah, it's surprising she was an actual murderer, because damn.
Well, how do we know? Maybe she was a murderer. How would we know?
Right. But no.
You never did see her and Jack the Ripper in the same room together. That's true.
Jill the Ripper. No, but I had a feeling it wasn't him, because it just seems so, I don't know, convenient. But I think what really, and it's always the weirdest things that I stick onto. In the theater, when he's complaining about the man getting up before the movie's over, I'm like, that's the fucking killer right there. That's the dude.
Yeah, it is. It's funny how little details can trip you up. With me, it was because when she used the first person killer before, he was the killer. And I thought, well, surely that's too obvious. Then it has to be not him. But the first time I read it, I didn't know kind of how. But I thought, and also it had that feeling of strangers on a train, like when you meet someone who would be the perfect patsy. And maybe I think, like my kind of JFK, like, is Lee Harvey Oswald a patsy? I think I'm always alert to people becoming stitch-up victims, basically, in life. So, yeah. Did you figure out that the cedar was the real murder that had to be detected even?
That I did not. And I'm like, I even kicked myself because Hastings is a smarter man than me for seeing the obvious.
Yeah, Hastings gets the killer clue that why was this particular letter delayed? And why did he put Poirot? Because he had to make sure that murder they didn't have much time to detect. And the whole reason why he was writing to Poirot, not just straight to Scotland Yard, is because a letter to Scotland Yard would never be delayed, whereas a letter to a private address could quite easily be misdirected. It's such a clever way of making that
really,
murder stand out.
It really is, and I just love it because, again, these are my first time through any of her books, so I'm kind of seeing a like progression of her ability to write and her ability to come up with such little clever scenarios that every time I feel like she's one-upping herself like Poirot does. And I feel like this one is the most, even though it is more of a downer book, this one is the most like her just sitting back like, oh, I am so clever. I can make a murder that only Poirot can solve, and that's because I am Poirot. Like, it's just such a fun. She almost has so much fun being so clever that it makes it really interesting and really fun.
It definitely is a case of like apply Occam's razor. Like at one point before the D murder, when the Legion is first forming, Poirot and Hastings have an exchange of like, in other cases, there's always a motive, like, passion, like love, money. And it's like right there should have been the tip off, like, well, who among these people has money? But when I first read it, I didn't catch it at all. I thought there was something up with like Alexander Bonaparte cuss, but I didn't know what, and I was not convinced one way or other that he was or wasn't the murderer. Like, I was very much just along for the ride on this one.
I think I'm just too sympathetic because immediately I was like, no, he just needs a hug, man.
I know, he's so sad. I will say, I don't know that she knew this or wrote it this way, and I looked up an article about the book that describes it as a seizure disorder. But what I do think actually that he suffers from is, back then they would have called it shell shock, or a little bit after this they start calling it combat fatigue. But I believe what he's suffering from is PTSD from being in the war with dissociative episodes.
Right. Yeah. He's yet another victim of World War One and trench warfare and all the shocks.
So tragic.
Yeah. So tragic, and such a again, comes from her experience as a nurse in World War One as a very, very young girl / woman, and seeing these boys just coming back physically, but most important, well, not most importantly, physically and equally mentally, very, very damaged by this war. So,
it's like Tommy Shelby says in Peaky Blinders, nobody came back.
Yeah, nobody came back untouched. Everyone was impacted. It is, in some respects, it's a sympathetic portrait. And what's interesting is when you read the first person from him, it's such a different character, so uncertain, so hesitating, so nervous, compared to the kind of very arrogant persona that is writing into Poirot.
Right.
Like kind of schoolboy smarmy, like no, I'm cleverer than you, and so like looking back on it in retrospect, it should be obvious these are two different people, but it wasn't when I first read it. It is now when I read it. It's as obvious as, the fact that the Jack the Ripper letters, the Dear Boss letters, weren't written by Jack the Ripper.
Well, I honestly had like BTK and Jeffrey Dahmer in my head, like public persona being so different than their other.
So you can have the same person write both because they're very different, public to private. Okay. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, it was almost like Professor Quirrell and Voldemort, like this sort of like does this guy have a dark passenger that he's out of control of kind of thing. Which I didn't, just given when it was written, I didn't really think that would be the case, but these were things that crossed my mind the first time reading it through. And his character is the most, I mean, obviously he comes out, not bashed in the head, but really he's the most victimized. And
yeah,
he's so fragile. It's so pathetic. Poor kid.
And tragic is the word, because you have to remember at this point he would be hung for these murders. And it's not the first time in Poirot's, career that he's going to save people from the gallows who've been falsely accused. And actually even the drunken German husband who's immediately arrested. There's a lot to be said for Poirot just being dogged in asking for the truth and saving the innocent. Anything else to say about the solution before we get into the adaptations?
I will say I'm very happy because once again she went to her suicide thing for an ending. However, as if she, heard people from the future yelling at her about this, she had Poirot had a pickpocket take out the bullets so he couldn't kill himself. And I appreciate that.
I appreciate that too.
I will say that the solution to this is the most unbelievable to me. Once I did read all the way through it, my biggest criticism was that I don't believe psychologically it would take a very specific psychopath to kill 4 people. And like, I understand the motivation and I understand, okay, getting away with murder. I don't know that there's somebody out there that would be capable of inflicting that kind of pain on random people in the world over a singular motivation like that. Or at least maybe I'm being naive and I would like to think not, but I don't think that there's another case in real life that would be like this. Maybe it would be a case of you're targeting one person in a family and the whole family has to go because there's witnesses and things.
But people
not
do this sort of thing all the time,
handpick.
don't they? I mean, look at In Cold Blood, the Truman Capote case. I mean, that was
But he was a serial killer.
Yeah.
And the motivation is hyper different from...
Oh, so you think the idea of a quote unquote normal person imitating a serial killer isn't credible? But I think what you have to understand by the end is that the little brother, he isn't just a normal village murderer just doing the one murder to get rid of people. He has to be more than that. And maybe he is a serial killer as we would conventionally understand it, because there is something psychopathic about that random, murdering of random people, motiveless, so to say. So I think you have to see him in a category that's different from the murderers, say the murder at the vicarage, where 2 people have got together to sort of, and I'll have to put a spoiler alert for Murder at the Vicarage now at the head of the spoiler warning. But, the idea that you've got 2 people who murder not just one, but a couple of people, right, just so they can be together effectively. So that this is
even that has like a rhyme and a reason to it. Do you see what I'm saying? Is like, if I was going to kill my business partner for money, and there was a case like this in Southern California where a man killed his business partner over money, and he killed his wife and their 2 children and their family dog. but it was all about the witnesses kind of thing. It wasn't that the murders of the other victims were premeditated solely to commit the one murder. That's, I think, where it's like very different, and hopefully that does not occur in real life. And I think I don't, maybe there is a psychologist out there listening who might be able to give some light to this, but I don't really feel like that, like dissociation and psychopathy would be realistic to be able to do that. And at least I'm hoping not.
Well, I mean, I think it's a few things that, like, I'm sure it's probably exaggerated a little bit, especially with not as wide a knowledge as we have now of human psychology. But I think, she set it up pretty simply, like, yeah, it was the greed thing. He wanted the fortune, but also, you add in the younger brother of an almost aristo family. And like, I don't know, I can believe in my mind that this character, he's been festering for years about trying to get the money, and he finally had an opportunity, but he saw a potential that he would lose it all permanently. And because he spent so much time with it, I can see him kind of just one of those characters or villains where they've spent so much time thinking and plotting that it's festered them and corrupted them. So I can totally see, like, well, this is my last opportunity to get this fortune. Let me just make sure I get it. And by doing that, let me kill a bunch of people to ensure there's no way I wouldn't get this fortune.
Yeah, I mean, it is a hell to try to get away with murder. I would like to believe that psychologically it's not really plausible in real life.
I mean, maybe it's easier to kill people you've got nothing to do with, and also, I think let's look at what we know about the character. So here's a quote from the book: "The daring, adventurous character, the roving life, the partiality for England that had showed itself very faintly in the jeer at foreigners. In your rather insular mind, you enjoyed scoring off a foreigner." So this is a guy who sees himself as superior. He is one of the landed gentry. His elder brothers made the fortune, but he is someone who lives in wealth. He's lived abroad, colonial. He's kind of ruled others. He's got used to the idea that there's a pecking order. This is not a democracy. It's not equality. There are people whose wants and desires matter more than other people's wants and desires. So his wants and desires matter more than the mere working classes. And that's just English people, let alone any pesky foreigners, right? So this is a person who naturally views his own, what will make him happy, and other people as effectively subordinate to that. So yes, it's a big leap to go from thinking other people are inferior to you to then just randomly murdering them to your own ends. But you can see how, making other people less than is a very good starting place to then thinking that they don't matter.
I guess maybe because I'm not a psychopath and I'm not a violent person, it's hard for me to imagine bringing yourself to murder anybody.
And that's
let alone
for
like
sure.
people you truly have no conflict with, right? Like, there's only a psychopath does that.
Yeah,
somebody who you've never met and has not wronged you.
And it's one of those weird things, right? So we're meant to think, oh, but it's not really a serial killer, it's just a family murder. But actually, it sort of is a serial killer, right? Because there is something different in this. There's a category difference in what it takes to do this versus just be a jealous husband and kill the person your wife's having an affair with, right? This is very different.
It's interesting. We should get one of those like lawyer reviews, Boston Legal or whatever. We should get like psychologist reviews. This one.
Yeah, I'm sure there is someone who's PhD on this, right? A psychological analysis of what's going on in ABC murders. There's probably people who've done the work. Yeah.
Or if you're a student and you need a dissertation topic, maybe that's, just throwing it out there.
This is the one. Okay, let's get into the adaptations of the novel. So apparently the first adaptation was a 1965 film called The Alphabet Murders, starring Tony Randall as Hercule Poirot, which was apparently played more for laughs than seriously, which,
That's creepy.
Well, I mean, starring Tony Randall, right, of the Odd Couple fame. So, yeah, I guess so. So, anyway, I haven't seen it. If anyone's seen it, let us know, because that sounds quite interesting. Maybe I'll try and track it down and watch it. In 1992, the novel was adapted for television as part of ITV's Agatha Christie's Poirot series in the UK. So that's part of the series that, they did all of them, starring David Suchet as Hercule Poirot, I think this is one of the finest in the series, if not the best. I think this is actually probably one of my favorite Agatha Christie adaptations of all time. Actually, did either of you get a chance to watch this?
Not that one, no.
Yeah, it's really worth seeking out. Partly because, or maybe almost entirely because, the person who plays Alexander Bonaparte Parkhurst is Donald Sumpter, who also went on many, many years later to play Maester Lewin in Game of Thrones. And he's just so sympathetic, and he just nails the role. He just gets all of that fragility and vulnerability and self-doubt, and I just think it genuinely moves me to tears. The scenes where he's in prison and he thinks he's going to hang genuinely move me to tears, and I think it's probably one of the greatest all-time Agatha Christie adaptations, and well worth watching if you haven't already. And then in 2018 there was a series of some high-profile adaptations by a woman called Sarah Phelps for the BBC, not ITV, so rival channel. It was aired as part of a 3-part mini-series over 3 consecutive days from Boxing Day, so just after Christmas, so between Christmas and New Year. And it was a big deal. It was a big deal that this was on British TV, partly because it starred John Malkovich as Hercule Poirot. It starred Rupert Grint of Harry Potter fame as Inspector Crome. The cast was, really high-powered. It starred Anya Chalotra as Lily Marbury, who is basically the daughter of the landlord where ABC is staying, who will then go and star as Yennefer of Vengerberg in the Netflix series The Witcher in a very early role. So John Malkovich as Hercule Poirot. Did either of you get to watch this one?
I started to watch it the other night, and it was so dark. Like, I turned it off because I'm like, okay, I'm not ready for this right now. Just the first few scenes, man, was really dark.
John Malkovich dark?
No, dark on top of dark. Literally in the first 10 minutes, there's some pretty interesting departures from the book. And I just was like, I'm not in a good headspace for all this right now. So I do intend to finish it, but I need to do something lighter for a while first.
So I was very excited when this was announced with John Malkovich, and I sat down day after Christmas, very excited to watch it, and I switched off. And I did actually go back and watch it all for this podcast. I mean, John Malkovich is obviously a genius, right? So always worth watching. But this is incredibly different from the novel. And I would argue that it says much more about the UK in 2018 than it does about Agatha Christie. You have to remember that the UK had a very controversial vote to leave the European Union in 2016. Surprisingly, Leave won, which shocked a lot of... It's the equivalent of England, of Donald Trump being elected in the US, where it shocked a whole bunch of liberal people in the States. It shocked the liberal, particularly London-centric people in the UK. And it really divided the country. And the perception of the Remain voters was that Britain was showing its true colours as being irredeemably racist, and that people who had voted to leave had done so because they were racist against immigration, and because that was one of the big hyped sort of issues in the campaign. So I'm making no political judgment, I'm just saying that is the spirit of the time. As a result, this 2018 adaptation of the ABC murders very much plays up the idea of Hercule Poirot as a foreigner, as an immigrant to this country, as a Belgian refugee during World War I, which is obviously very much in the source text, and someone who's never been accepted and who continues to face racism even though he's successful. It very much plays up the fact, which is also in history, that there was a rise in, or there was a very small British Union, a fascist party that, never won a seat in Parliament. And whenever they tried to kick stuff off in the East End of London, got beaten up under Oswald Mosley. But it posits a Britain in 1936 that was very, very racist, and that was on the verge, there, but for the grace of God, we could have been Germany. It posits a world of, I don't know, really nasty stuff going on with the character of Inspector Japp and Inspector Crome. We have all sorts of flashbacks to John Malkovich, who in this version, Hercule Poirot was a Catholic priest in World War I. And there was, an encounter with some German soldiers. and some people he was trying to hide that went south. And it's just incredibly dark. It's nothing like the book. The first three murders are all committed in locations that have some relevance to Poirot. Again, the refugee theme. He helped deliver a baby when on a refugee train, when a refugee train stopped in Andover. It's just kind of like they're really, really trying to play up the concept of Britain being just like racist then, racist now, very anti-refugee, very anti-immigrant, and just a really nasty, horrible place to be, I think. There's an e-murder as well, randomly. I'm trying to think what else happens that's really, really random.
Well, just like the way that they have the gal that Cust is staying with.
Oh yeah, so he's kind of like the landlord's daughter,
pouring out her daughter. Like she gives him this big lecture about morality, and then you hear like sex sounds from upstairs, and she's like, "Oh, yeah, that's just and also daughter giving a massage. It's £1. You can pay me." Like, oh,
yeah.
So
the
gross.
daughter, yeah. So the landlady's daughter is a prostitute, and
so dark.
And Alexander Bonaparte's cast isn't this sort of like quite sympathetic, quite sort of shy, introverted, sort of insecure guy. He's got some weird sexual fetishes that she helps work through with him. It's just so messy. It's so far from the book. The one thing that
who's
I thought
also
was
played by the winged helmet guy from the Witcher series.
Yeah. So
and the landlady's played by Moaning Myrtle. I don't know her name.
Yeah, Moaning Myrtle. She's an amazing actress.
She's a fantastic actress, man. She plays crazy really well.
Yeah, Shirley Henderson. She's amazing as the landlady.
Yeah,
other things to point out is that John Malkovich has a terrible accent. He can't do the Poirot accent.
There are a few who can.
Yeah.
He can only do a John
But also,
Malkovich
it doesn't make
accent.
sense. Yeah, well, he does do an accent. It's just not a very good Belgian one. It also makes no sense that Poirot is no longer famous and can't get in to see the police, and the police mock him, because the whole point is that ABC writes to him because he knows he has access to the police. But he also knows that when he delays a letter, that will also serve as a delay to the police. It's kind of like if Poirot is no longer famous, what's the point? But then, of course, they have to make it a point by making him linked to the murder town. So the whole thing is like, just use the plot as written, because then your attempt to make a solution for the thing that you messed up is also rubbish. Yeah,
I did appreciate that John Malkovich had a little bit of a belly.
Yeah.
I did catch on to that, and I was like, oh, that's good,
Yeah. Anyway, so the other big change is that the killer, well, actually, no, I won't get it. I mean, like, it's just, I think, in a sense, when I watched it the second time and I knew I was really going to hate it, so I was watching it sort of far less emotively, I could really appreciate a lot of the production design, and I could really appreciate the costume design, and a lot of the kind of the aesthetics of it I thought were really good. And in a way, some of the stuff that we've been discussing in these episodes about some of the hidden regressive stuff that's in the novels, like the misogyny or the racism, whatever it is, in a sense, what this adaptation is doing is taking these little snippets that are under the surface and just bringing them out full throttle. But I find it just very, like I say, I think it's sociologically a very good statement of what, well, I guess mathematically, like 48% or 49% of British voters probably thought of the other 51, 52% in 2018. So it tells you something really valuable about the kind of the public discourse of the time. But I would say watch the ITV 1992 one, because A, it's more faithful, but B, it's really moving. It's a really, really great film to watch. So I don't know. That's all I have to say about that.
Well, now I do want to watch the 1990.
Yeah, definitely try finding it, because it's really good.
I don't think I'll be interested in that Tony Randall joint, but I do want to watch.
I might watch it just for shits and giggles if you can get hold of it. I mean, like, why not? I mean, that sounds quite funny. A bit like that one with what was the one we watched? The 3-act murder where you've got Tony Curtis in the Caribbean. Hilarious. Anything else you'd like to say about this book, boys and girls, in the final moments of this podcast?
Always love the book's ending with Poirot making just the silliest little jokes.
Yes, exactly. Bringing us back to a point of levity and loveliness and happy endings with ABC released from jail. Yep, I agree. All is right with the world.
Also a boon for Hastings, No, I lied about that for us.
Yeah.
It was good,
Absolutely. Oh, it's a great book. I was so looking forward to reading it. I'm so pleased you enjoyed it, Zander. And I don't know, like Hannah, without spoiling it, what is your view on Cards on the Table? Like, is that one that you've read?
I've never read it. No.
Oh, okay. Well, I would suggest maybe we reconvene at some point with that, because I do think it's genuinely a very tricksy book. And in a sense, it's kind of the distillation of the Closed House mystery, right? It's and you get some really great characters. It's one of the first times we meet Ariadne Oliver. So Zander, Agatha Christie at this point is so confident in her writing ability and her ability to understand what it is to be a world famous author that she actually creates a meta version of Agatha Christie called Ariadne Oliver, who writes detective novels and becomes a detective in these books.
Love it.
So
I love it.
Yeah. And Poirot
know,
really respects her. Yeah, they are like they detect together. It's so she puts herself in the book with Poirot. It's just brilliant.
oh, that's great. No, and I love stories in a static environment as well. I don't know why. It's just if you can make that compelling, I love it.
Yeah, exactly. This is sort of back to that sort of Orient Express style. Everything happens in a carriage. So, and really interesting characters in this one as well. I think really, yeah. I think I reread it. Well, I'm rereading it right now, and I'm about sort of a third of the way through, and I was just like, yeah, this is one of them ones that it's kind of maybe not as famous, but I think it's repays reading. And Hannah, I'm excited for you to. I'm sure there's an amazing audiobook version for you or radio play version for you to get into. So
yeah, and then we'll be on Death on the Nile pretty soon, huh?
yeah, which is one of my all-time favorites. And I'm not sure necessarily if it's because it's the best detective novel, but I find the characters really compelling, and I love the Egyptian setting. I find it just so romantic. So yeah, I'm looking forward to getting to that.
Well, I'm looking at the list,
because you got.
And if we play our cards right and we go at the pace we've been going, we'll be able to do Hercule Poirot's Christmas right around Christmas.
Oh, wonderful! Well, that will be, we will have to deliberately engineer our timing to make that happen. So.
But then we'll have 3 in a row that are pretty good. So, and then There Were None, Sad Cypress, and Evil Under the Sun all come in succession.
Wow, she really did hit a purple streak, right? I mean, it's kind of a thing. All righty. Well, anyway, I'm so pleased we could reconvene the banners and do this book. It's so fun chatting with you guys. What we hope for you, dear listener, is that this podcast is a little bit like Hastings, Japp, and Poirot. This like little ramshackle trio that's just giving you a little bit of familiarity over these many episodes and a bit of organic love and a little bit of joy amidst all the craziness that is real life. And we hope you enjoyed listening and keep listening and follow us on this journey. So, posse out.
Indeed.